One of the workshops at the Politics of Conspiracy Conference held in Boston the weekend of February 1st, 1975 was called Domestic Intelligence, but more than that was revealed. The conference was sponsored by the Cambridge-based Assassination Information Bureau. The panelists at the workshop were Mark Lane and Donald Freed, co-authors of Executive Action, Richard Popkin, author of The Second Oswald, and Tim Butts of the Fifth Estate. That's an organization concerned with keeping a citizen eye on the intelligence community. We begin with Tim Butts.
Like its foreign counterpart, domestic intelligence operations do not exist in a vacuum, nor are they mounted arbitrarily and capriciously, but rather domestic intelligence operations are mounted for very specific reasons, after a very scientific analysis of available facts conducted by the various organizations which conduct domestic intelligence operations. If we were to sit in this room and try and make a list of those organizations, I think we could come up with some 200 U.S. government intelligence, not intelligence organizations, but U.S. government organizations which collect information of intelligence value and store that and make that available to other organizations, other government organizations, and in some cases private and corporate organizations for the purpose of intelligence. We all know about the traditional agencies such as the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency. Last night NBC began to expose the fact that the National Security Agency, the nation's electronic warfare arm, was now engaged in domestic operations. We know of the Drug Enforcement Agency. But how many of us know of TAD-40, which is the Transportation Department's intelligence unit that was mounted during the truckers' strike and continues today to collect intelligence information on dissident truckers? Operations against labor, operations against students, operations against anti-war forces, operations against third world movements are all mounted by the federal government, by various arms of the federal government, because those movements pose a threat to the security of the state. And when those movements become a threat to a state, they become a threat to corporate power. And when they become a threat to both corporate power and to the state, then action must be taken. And I think the most classic example of how far the U.S. government and the corporations are willing to go in mounting domestic intelligence operations is the FBI's counterintelligence program. And last night, if you were at the initial meeting last night, I talked for just a few minutes about COINTELPRO, and I'd like to expand on that a little bit before turning the microphone over to Mark. On the night of March 8, 1971, a group of people broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and liberated a large series of documents which have since become known as the Media Papers. For those of you who are interested in investigating the FBI especially, I really urge you to get a copy of the Media Papers, which are available from Win Magazine in Rifton, New York. They did a special issue where they reproduced some documents and retypeset and published a bulk of other documents relating to domestic intelligence operations. And buried in that 60, 70-some pages of Media Papers in Win Magazine was one lone document with one word on it that has led to the uncovering of the entire COINTELPRO thing. And that was a memorandum from an FBI officer, FBI agent in media, to a professor at a college, offering, it discussed the offer of material that would pose a right-wing analysis of the campus threat, of campus disturbances. And on the routing form for this memo was the word COINTELPRO. And when lots of people looked at that series of documents, everyone saw the word COINTELPRO, but only one person did anything about it. And that man's name was Ron Plusser, is Ron Plusser. He's a Washington attorney. And acting on behalf of Carl Stern, Ron Plusser filed a Freedom of Information Act suit against the FBI for the revelation of all documents relating to COINTELPRO. It was subjected to several hearings, and finally on December 7th, I believe it was, 1973, the FBI released a series of documents which outlined 7 areas of FBI counterintelligence operations. Those documents showed that in 1957, the Communist Party was subjected to an FBI counterintelligence program, that in 1961, that program was expanded to include the Socialist Workers' Party, that in 1964, as a result of the death of civil rights workers in the South and the cry from the liberal community that the FBI attacked racist groups in the South, there was a counterintelligence program mounted against the Ku Klux Klan. In 1967, there was a 4th counterintelligence program mounted against what J. Edgar Hoover termed black nationalists. And in 1968, the New Left. In the documents that were released, Hoover is very explicit as to why counterintelligence programs are necessary. He wanted the FBI to be able to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, miscredit, or otherwise neutralize dissident forces. It's very important that we look at each and every one of those. Exposure. In Hoover's view, that meant to show the communist element that was behind every threat to the U.S. government, what he viewed as the communist element. People working in coalitions with communists were automatically branded communists. People working on anything outside of a pro-government program were to be exposed as communists. Disruption. In these documents and subsequent documents released by the FBI, disruption is very clearly outlined. That is to play upon the personal differences, such as Don was talking about, that exist within organizations, and to blow those up as far as possible so as to diffuse energy, to diffuse people's hopes, to diffuse people's vision and focus of what the political task at hand was, and to send them off into 1,000 directions. To discredit the same area as exposure, to try and, if public reaction to red baiting does not have the desired results, you'll have something to the effect of Hoover's allegations against the Berrigans before the Harrisburg indictments, where he tried to discredit the entire religious left by talking about a fantastic kidnapping plan targeted against the Secretary of State and the blowing up of tunnels inside the halls of Congress. And finally, we have or otherwise neutralize. And this is kind of like the catch-all phrase, and perhaps it's the most scary phrase and the one that leaves the door open to the fact that at various times, perhaps even the FBI, which is supposed to be the highest law enforcement agency in the country, has considered the use of political assassinations. Neutralize is a term that has come to signify the Phoenix program, because the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which killed over 20,000 Vietnamese in the name of anti-communism, was designed to neutralize the infrastructure of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. Now, whether Hoover used neutralize strictly as a euphemism for assassination or whether he meant it in its more general term is something that we'll all be debating for a number of years. And Mr. Hoover, having died, of course, will never be able to reach his real motives on that. But we do know that the FBI has basically admitted to every sort of tactic short of assassination in the conduction of its counterintelligence programs. Agents provocateurs have infiltrated demonstrations. Deep cover agents have penetrated organizations, never disrupting but simply collecting intelligence and feeding that back to FBI agents who would then send in short-term agents to disrupt. The conspiratorial mind of the FBI, especially in the area of counterintelligence programs, basically had no limits. Its only limit was in the fact that they proceeded scientifically, that they didn't act rashly, that they didn't allow their emotions to carry it out something on the spur of the moment. And this was programmed into the entire counterintelligence operation by Hoover himself. And what Hoover did when he established the first COINTELPRO process, and as it grew through 1968, was to set up a mechanism. And I think we can all accept the fact that John Edgar Hoover was a god inside the FBI, that no FBI agent would dare cross him, that no FBI agent would ever do anything that would violate the letter or the spirit of a Hoover order. And it's in that light that we have to look at the process by which COINTELPRO was conducted. In every FBI field office throughout the country, there is one agent who is assigned to be the counterintelligence program coordinator. This agent ran informants and collected intelligence through other methods, through overt methods such as newspapers and whatnot, and made an analysis of the weaknesses of dissident organizations based on those facts. And then he might discuss those weaknesses with his counterparts and his superiors, or he may summarily decide that a certain course of action would serve to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the organization. That was written up in the form of a proposal. You know, even though the time may be right for doing it now, the agent had to wait. He had to write a letter which went to Hoover's office in Washington, where William Sullivan was the primary coordinator of the counterintelligence program. And that proposal to disrupt or neutralize a dissident organization was judged right in the very offices of the director of the FBI. 2,000 some counterintelligence program operations are admitted to by the FBI, and every one of those operations was approved by headquarters in Washington. Now, it's obvious that some of those decisions were made as a matter of, bureaucratic paper shuffling. Some of them were very simple. Some of them were misinformation operations, where false information was leaked or false information planted within an organization in order to create distrust or to make people believe there is a political climate that existed that was counterposed to what the reality of a political situation was. And some of those operations were much higher than that. Some of them were very serious things. We may never know exactly what all 2,000 of those operations are. There are some people who are continuing to pursue discovery through the Fred Hampton case and other cases that involve the FBI that may show us what the final blows were from Hoover's office. But I think it would be naive on our part to think that Sullivan and Hoover acted without consultation with other people, that they had their own circle of advisors, and that within that circle, those counterintelligence operations were at times, I won't say every time and for everyone, but it is my firm belief that those operations, some of those operations, were discussed with people outside the Bureau. And finally, a decision is reached. Out of the over 5,000 some requests made by FBI agents to conduct counterintelligence operations, something like 2,500 were approved. A little over half of them were approved and carried out by the FBI between 1957 and April 19th, 1971. It was the actual exposure of that was generated from the media papers that we feel led to the abolition of counterintelligence program. Less than 35 days after the media break-in and the documents marked COINTELPRO taken from the FBI office, the program was suddenly terminated, at least officially. It was terminated only as a consolidated program. You have to remember that on April 19th, 1971, when Hoover ordered the program terminated, approximately 2,000 Vietnam veterans had just arrived in Washington, D.C. for the first large veterans demonstration, that they were to demonstrate for a week. They were to be followed by a week of aggressive lobbying by predominantly pacifist organizations, and then May Day was coming, when thousands of people were going to go into the streets and risk beating and deaths to stop the government and force the government to escalate the cost of the war to such a point that they had to force total and immediate American withdrawal. And it's very strange that Hoover would abolish this program at such a point, such a critical point, when one of the primary focuses of counterintelligence operations had been the anti-war movement. And when you sit back and you read the press reports, especially of the FBI's version of COINTELPRO, they all say the program ran through these dates and that after April 19th, 1971, there was no more COINTELPRO. But nothing could really be further from the truth. What Hoover did when he abolished the counterintelligence program is that he told his FBI agents at every field office that if they wanted to carry out counterintelligence operations in the future, what they had to do was file a request. But they could no longer use the COINTELPRO caption on the document, that the program as a consolidated program was abolished, and that every counterintelligence program type activity would have to be considered on what Hoover called a case-by-case basis according to its case caption file. In other words, if I was an FBI agent and I wanted to conduct a counterintelligence operation against the Black Panther Party in my area, instead of writing a request and following the procedures of COINTELPRO, I would simply write a letter and forward it to the Black Panther Party coordinating section of the FBI in Washington, and then it would be taken and a decision made within the director's level, an assistant director's level. That is how the FBI has circumvented the public outrage on COINTELPRO. It is one thing that the media, for whatever reasons it has, whether it's incapable of reading and understanding the documents or whether it refuses to believe that counterintelligence operations could still be continuing today, there just has not been any real emphasis in the press on the fact that Hoover left a very clear road open for counterintelligence programs. There have been some books written about COINTELPRO. Ironically, the most revealing book about COINTELPRO is written from a liberal right standpoint of how the FBI smashed the Ku Klux Klan. And it was written before people knew that there was actually something called COINTELPRO. And I wish that I had the name of it with me, but I don't. And rather than go into a long, rambling thing much longer on COINTELPRO, for those of you that are interested, there's this tabloid that's available out at near the registration area that was prepared by the Fifth Estate that outlines how COINTELPRO was carried out in a little bit more detail, and some of the documents that relate to COINTELPRO are reproduced in it. The final thing that I'd like to say on COINTELPRO is that we are proceeding with an investigation of the death of Fred Hampton from a slightly different standpoint of things that have been done in the past. The forensic evidence on the death of Fred Hampton has proved that the Panthers inside the apartment on December 4th, 1969 in Chicago did not fire the first shot at the state attorney's police as they raided the apartment at, I believe it was 4 a.m. or 4:30 a.m. That the first shots were in fact fired by the police. And there's been a book called Search and Destroy written by a commission of people headed by Ramsey Clark and Roy Wilkins, which outlines that forensic evidence very well. And when these counterintelligence program documents were released, Hoover really centered in on black nationalists and people that he thought were capable of coalescing a black movement inside this country and taking it beyond a nationalist movement into a multiracial movement for social change. And on March 4th, 1968, after he had already established a counterintelligence program against black nationalist groups, Hoover wrote a second memo ordering his agents into some very specific tasks for counterintelligence operations against black organizations. And I think it reflects what eventually became Hoover's hopes and views for all counterintelligence operations against all segments of society. The first thing on that list is that Hoover wanted to prevent the rise of a black messiah. Someone who would, and that was Hoover's term, a black messiah, who could coalesce and energize blacks and lead them away from the liberal doctrine of nonviolence. That is, those are paraphrasing Hoover's words. Second, he wanted to prevent a coalition. First, a coalition of black organizations, and secondly, a coalition of black organizations and white militants. Third, he wanted to prevent, quote, the gaining of respect, end quote, for any black nationalist movement. He wanted to prevent the long-range growth of black organizations inside the United States. And last on the list was he wanted to prevent violence from the hands of black nationalists. When the FBI released a report on November 17th of last year on the depth of COINTELPRO, they admitted to the 5 areas that I just talked about: SWP, Communist Party, New Left, Ku Klux Klan, and black nationalist counterintelligence programs. They also admitted they had 2 programs that weren't previously explained, one dealing with Soviet satellite intelligence, in other words, FBI activities to neutralize the KGB, and they refused to comment on that for national security reasons. And reasonable people in society could say, well, yes, we can't compromise our operations against a foreign intelligence force operating inside our own country. So they didn't release any information on Soviet satellite COINTELPRO. But there was a 7th area of counterintelligence program that they also refused to comment on. That was special operations. And they said that they couldn't comment on special operations because it also dealt with foreign intelligence operations, efforts to neutralize Chinese agents operating inside the United States. But what Mr. Kelly forgot to say when he released that report, or what he forgot to think of when he was authorizing and finalizing that document, is that the FBI itself had released documents concerning special operations COINTELPRO, which show, in fact, that it was targeted at least in part against the Black Panther Party. Why would they want to cover up, if they admit to operations against black nationalist organizations and other segments of society, why do they want to cover up? Why do they want to keep secret what was done under special operations? We have this basic fact to operate on. The FBI lied about special operations, that the FBI provided much of the information that led to the raid on the Panther apartment on December 4th, and that just knowing those 2 facts and understanding the counterintelligence program, we feel that some of the truths behind how far counterintelligence operations inside the United States would go are contained in that area called special operations. And that's where our energies in terms of an investigation are going to be perhaps a little bit different from those of other researchers and other investigators, in that we have now identified a specific area of government operations that we feel can be tied in or may be the root of a political assassination. And there are others here at this conference that will disagree with me on this, and I respect their view, who feel that it may have been done by another government agency, that perhaps a Central Intelligence Agency was involved. And I encourage them to continue their efforts, just as we are going to continue ours, to investigate FBI counterintelligence programs. J. Edgar Hoover was a racist pig, and nothing scared him more than Fred Hampton and the kind of militancy and the kind of internationalism that Fred Hampton represented. And I firmly believe that when we dig into special operations, when the truth is finally known, when more people inside the FBI take the turns that Bill Turner has took or Philip Agee from the CIA have took, we will eventually find out the truth. There are other things to talk about in terms of domestic operations. Like I said, counterintelligence program is just one operation carried out by one organization. And there are dozens of others. Military intelligence continues to operate within the confines of the United States. They've cleaned their act up a little bit, but veterans organizations, radical veterans organizations, and GI projects are targeted by those organizations. Drug enforcement is escalating. God only knows what sort of prototype operations are being refined under its aegis. Last year in Portage County, Ohio, a young Kent State student was killed by a local drug enforcement agent who was operating in a federally funded drug enforcement program called MAT Drug Enforcement. MAT stood for Mahoning, Ashtabula, and Trumbull counties. And we've been checking around the country a little bit as we travel, and we find out that this little 3-county drug enforcement agency isn't an aberration, but rather there's a pattern of them existing in different parts of the country. And so one of the energies and one of the focuses that should be had by people investigating domestic intelligence operation is, what are the police scientists? What are the masters of police science learning from the use of multi-municipal, multi-county police forces and strike forces, and how are they going to apply that to other areas of social behavior? How are they going to apply that to the political arena? I don't want to say much more. I think that I'd like to turn the microphone over to Mark and close by saying that, you know, there's 200 agencies out there, and we all know they have something going, and anything that anybody here can add to that is definitely welcome.
Next to speak on the panel is Mark Lane, author of Rush to Judgment.
I'd like to discuss briefly the question of domestic intelligence and how it was applied and how it is being applied for the purpose of supporting the greatest cover-up in our country's history, the assassination of President Kennedy, and to place that discussion in the context of politics in recent days. It's during the latter part of this century, we've seen the development of an extremely strong executive for the first time in our country's history, an executive which is so strong that it has utilized and compromised the other two theoretically equal branches of government, the legislature and the judiciary. And there's no better example of that, I think, than the utilization of the legislature and the judiciary in support of the executive document. The Warren Commission report was done very cleverly. And it had to be done cleverly because they expected us to accept something which was not acceptable, and which, in fact, millions of people did accept. The concept that every time any important political leader in this country is assassinated or wounded, that we are to believe that one lone nut did it. And we are to believe that as soon as the first FBI agent or local police officer makes that statement, before the pistol has cooled, that is to be accepted by us. Before that, let's say the forensic evidence never showed that shots came from two different directions. Let's say all the evidence showed that, in fact, Oswald fired the shot, all of the shots. How would they know the first day that he did it alone? How would they know that he had not talked to people? Someone had not paid him. There had not been a conspiracy in which he was the lone active participant. Yet in every one of the assassinations, or the attempted assassination of George Wallace, there is the instant report by the police, a lone nut did it by himself, before even the beginning of an adequate investigation to determine whether or not someone else had inspired him. So we were expected to accept that. At the same time, we were expected to accept the concept that 2 priests and 5 nuns entered into conspiracy to blow up the tunnels in Washington and kidnap Henry Kissinger. And what would they do with him after they had him? Who would want him? In any event, that is a conspiracy that we are supposed to accept. Of course, the jury didn't, but a grand jury did prior to that. We are supposed to accept the idea that Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor, entered into a massive conspiracy, and some people accepted that. In fact, so did Ramsey Clark, who prosecuted him, later changed his mind. So those are the conspiracies which are acceptable as far as the government is concerned. Although there is no basis for them, although a jury, hearing the evidence, rejects them, and every other major conspiracy which has been submitted to American juries in the last 5 years, all rejected, all acquitted, all the defendants. But the only area where, according to the power structure, no conspiracy ever takes place is the conspiracies when they are involved in trying to bring about direct political change by direct political action through the utilization of firearms. And we are supposed to accept the fact that there was no conspiracy in any of those events. That's a hard job that they're faced with. And they have met that very difficult task splendidly through the utilization of their domestic intelligence services in this country. First of all, let's see how they utilize the other portions of government. Do you remember the days, most of you probably don't, if Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he was president, if he went into a restaurant in Washington, D.C., and in that same restaurant, 50 yards away in a large restaurant, was a member of the United States Supreme Court eating dinner, that was a headline in the Hearst newspapers about how they were together. These are supposed to be separate branches of government. And it is true that there was a great concern about separating those branches. Yet when the time came, when the crunch came, and it seemed essential for the power structure to prove that Oswald was the lone assassin, the President of the United States called upon the Chief Justice to issue a report. Never happened before in the history of this country that such a thing was done. And the judiciary was compromised. How compromised were they? When I criticized the Warren Commission report and said I didn't believe it, I remember the bar in New York, I was called before the Committee of Discipline of the New York State Bar Association of the Bar of the City of New York. And they began disciplinary proceedings which might have led to my disbarment. What was the charge? That I publicly contested the statement made by the Chief Justice of the United States. That was the sole charge. And that was becoming a very serious question. At that time, I talked to Ed Ennis, who was then General Counsel of the ACLU, who had been Solicitor General of the United States under Roosevelt, and he came in and represented me. And I think had it not been for his representation, he did a very good job, but for the fact that he represented a certain force, that they would have moved forward against a lawyer for saying, I don't believe the Warren report. And that is the utilization of the judiciary, to silence all of those who in any way are controlled or can be influenced by the judiciary. And how about the legislature? Well, during the latter part of this century, the federal legislature almost has not functioned at all. Lyndon Johnson wanted a blank check. Then there's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which even Fulbright voted for, right? Thereby, do whatever you want, Chief Executive. And taking that one step further, the President of the United States secured the chairman, as the chairman, the Chief Justice, and then involved the legislature by having the two major leaders of the Republican Party in the House and the Senate, and the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate, serve on the Warren Commission, including Ford, who was then the whip Republican Party in the House. And in that way, we now have, under the roof of the Chief Executive, the force which controls the secret police. Under that roof, we now have a report issued by the Chief Executive utilizing the secret police and compromising the judiciary and the legislature. And who is to complain after that? It's similar to the use of the legislature regarding the illegal acts of the Central Intelligence Agency. Until this session of Congress, no one in Congress dared to raise the question of CIA and its illegal actions, because there was an oversight committee, CIA Oversight Committee. It's true they were not told very much, but they were told just enough so that Stennis, for example, Senator Stennis, knew enough to be compromised. And he did everything he could. He fought tooth and nail to become the chairman of the committee which was going to investigate the CIA. But he was so deeply implicated himself and so deeply involved because as chairman of the Oversight Committee, he was given information and took no action. And therefore it was possible for the CIA to say, as they have said, and as they continue to say, Congress knew about it. Of course, 99 senators didn't know about it, and over 400 members of the House didn't know about it, but a few key persons knew enough about what had taken place so that the Congress was compromised. Well, now we have seen a new development. It's a brand new development, flowing from Watergate, from the Irvin Commission report, the Irvin Committee investigation report, from the awareness of what took place. And even back in 1964, there was fear because there was such concern in this country about the charge that Oswald was a lone assassin. There was fear then that the legislature might do something. In fact, at the time the Warren Commission was appointed, there were 2 committees in the House and 2 committees in the Senate that said they were going to conduct an investigation, each of them, into the assassination of John Kennedy, and quickly the Warren Commission was appointed, utilizing members of the House, members of the Senate, and that was the end of any investigation. Now, the difference between what Irvin did with that committee and what Warren did with his commission is clear. And one of the differences is we saw what happened when the witnesses testified before the Irvin Committee. Didn't make any difference whether Irvin and his committee ever issued a report. We saw it ourselves. We drew our own conclusions. The Warren Commission met in top secrecy, behind closed doors. In fact, after the first day, the meetings took place in the Veterans of Foreign Wars building. After the first day, Earl Warren came down, the press surrounded him, Marina Oswald had testified, and a reporter said, "When will we get the facts, Mr. Chief Justice?" And he said, "You may never get the facts in your lifetime, and I mean that seriously." That was his statement. And had we decided to rely upon him and his 6 colleagues, we never would have gotten the facts in our lifetime. And yet the press was not even concerned about that. There was no outrage about the crime. What was secret about an investigation? There are secrets. I mean, if one believes that the CIA has any valid role at all to play, I'm not one of those who take that position. But that's the way, I'll be through in just a minute, that's the way the matter was investigated. And having compromised the legislature, having compromised the judiciary, with the chief executive utilizing the police forces, there appeared to be no way that it would be possible to expose what was taking place. And the first approach, there were 3 basic approaches that the government used in terms of its domestic intelligence operation. The first was silence. Network, radio, and TV, not one word of dissent in this country for 2 years, from the time those shots were fired. You can't believe that now, right? You hear it on the radio, you see it in the newspapers. 2 solid years without a single word permitted in which someone said, "I doubt the Warren report," or maybe there's a question. 2 years without a question being raised on a network radio or television program in this country. Do you really believe that somehow every network in this country, every single program which was syndicated, they just all decided on their own that this is just not a subject to be discussed? And then all of a sudden, a couple of years later, they all decided it was? What brought about the change? Well, for example, the Associated Press and the United Press International have in their New York offices employees of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whose primary job, they also get paid by UPI and AP, whose primary job is, or was, if a story comes in which has information which is derogatory to the Central Intelligence Agency or the FBI, their job is to stop the story, file a hold against it. That's one of the techniques, and state that hold, don't send it out, more information coming in. And it will be, all of this will be incorporated in the next story. No more information ever comes in. There's nothing to incorporate, and that story is killed effectively. CIA and the FBI have such operations in most of the major cities in this country to see to it that the story does not even reach New York. For example, the UPI filed a story here yesterday in Boston about the conference, about an aspect of the conference. That's... Oh. You didn't hear anything I said so far? I'll speak louder. I think it'll be easier. The UPI reporter here filed a story yesterday in Boston. Okay. That story goes to Boston, goes out here in Boston. In order for the story to be stopped entirely, there would have to be someone at the Boston office who files a hold here. Otherwise, it goes on to New York and can be stopped in New York by someone associated with the CIA or the FBI and the payroll who's working also ostensibly for UPI in this case or for AP. But there has to be someone at both cities in order to make sure that in case it does get from here to there, it's stopped there and gets no further. This story, as I understand it, did get out. But it's now 11 years after the fact, and it took a long time. There are correspondence now. There are letters now available among the lawyers of the Warren Commission talking about, well, this person is going to make a statement. Contact our contact at the AP. Make sure it does not go out. Those are the letters now, we find now, 11 years later, in terms of their utilization of the intelligence forces available to them. And that worked for a while. That worked for some time. The second area, when that stops working, when it is possible to prevail, to reach large numbers of people in this country, is to find some way to answer those charges, to answer the charges, to engage in some kind of a debate. And that took a long time. That took over 2.5 years before the government felt so much had come out, despite every effort, that there was no way to pretend that it wasn't happening. It was out there reaching millions of people in this country. Flo and I remember way back in December of 1963, we're doing radio programs in New York City. And then we would be invited, and we'd do them by telephone to other cities. And then we'd go out and we'd travel around. Flo Kennedy.
The judge would get your ass.
What?
Then the judge would get your ass.
Then the judge would get our ass, yeah. Then there were some problems of that nature. But it was possible in college campuses. I spoke, I think, at 300 college campuses that first year following the assassination. It was possible to reach large numbers of people, not through the network media. And when that had happened, when it was possible to reach enough people, then the intelligence forces were utilized in another way. It was impossible to suppress it, obviously. It was out. The secret was no longer a secret. Too many people were sharing it. Then the question is, how do you answer it? The Associated Press sent out a scurrilous attack on the critics in the longest original story ever filed by the Associated Press in its history. It was nothing but a scurrilous attack upon every critic of the Warren Commission report, in which our views were presented and destroyed. And not one of the critics whose views were presented was ever interviewed. It was just their view of what we must have meant, which was then, after the straw man was erected, it was then demolished. And we saw not only AP, we saw CBS. This was not a question serious enough to permit one word of debate until that time on a network program. And then there's Walter Cronkite. 4 hours, 4 nights in a row to support the Warren Commission report, a subject so unimportant that not one word of controversy about it had been permitted by then for up until 3 years for CBS. And that was done. But then there was Jim Garrison. How do you handle Jim Garrison? And so there was a 2-hour program by NBC. And Huntley and Brinkley were told to do it. And they said no. They refused to. And so it was given to Frank McGee, and he agreed to do it and moved up rapidly in the hierarchy of NBC because he did the job. As distasteful as it was to him, he did the job on Jim Garrison. And then there was a record company. What was that? Columbia Records that did it with Lawrence Schiller. I don't know if you know that name, Lawrence Schiller. Okay. He went around interviewing the critics. He said there's no question, but he really believed that there was something wrong, and he put the evidence together on a record which Columbia released. He interviewed me for about 3 hours. I think one of my sentences is on there out of context and distorted. But they sold the record. Hear the story about the assassination. Hear what Mark Lane has to say about this. First one was the headline. One sentence on there in a full LP record. But the rest of it was the attack upon us, put out by Columbia Records in our effort to get an injunction to stop it. Absolutely impossible, even though there was a great deal of false advertising involved. Then there's an investigation which has been set up there. And one of the well-known reporters in the New York Times. First of all, there was Peter Keith, who had been with the New York Times for 25 years. The finest reporter that I've ever met. Because when you tell something to Peter Keith, and you say, these are the 3 sources, he travels there, or he makes the phone calls, and he checks it out, and they say, well, I got it from this, and he checks it out, every single detail. And 4 days later, he may just publish 1 paragraph. But that's the old kind of old-fashioned journalism which we saw in the movies 20 years ago. It's all accurate, because he's all checked it all out, and I've never heard of him being in a position where anybody said it was not true or it's unfair, because he checks out every single detail. And when he saw this Zapruder film, Peter Keith of the New York Times, he cried. And he went to see the managing editor. And he said, they blew his head off. Look at this, they blew his head off. And we haven't told the truth about it. They said, all right, there'll be an investigation. Then Harrison Salisbury was going to do the investigation with them. But then they called him off and it was canceled. And there never was the investigation. Where did that pressure come from? I don't know. I know where the pressure came from to keep Rush to Judgment from being published. I talked about that last night. Direct intervention by the Federal Bureau of Investigation going to the publishers of books and saying, you cannot publish this book. We do not want this book published. And so that's the second stage. The stage of answering, but it's not really an answer. It's a scurrilous attack, taking our position out of context. It didn't work. Then they published books called The Scavengers, but nobody buys them. And Columbia Record was doing really well. First week it was dynamite. It was out there with, oh yeah, hear what the critics have to say. And then we went on a network television program, a couple of us, and said it's untrue. It doesn't tell what we have to say. We're trying to get the record stopped. The sales fell off like that, and it was the end of the record. It only sold for 1 week. And so the answers never really worked when they were non-answers because people were too intelligent to do it that. And so they said, okay, we got to debate them. There's got to be a confrontation. That's the only way. So they sent Alfred Jenner, one of the lawyers of the commission, to debate with me in the Jerry Williams show when Jerry had the show in Chicago, the CBS show. And we were going to be on from 8 o'clock to midnight. And we were on I was on Jerry Williams' show last night, and he recalled the event. This is his language, not mine. There's no modesty or lack of it involved. Anyone who knew anything about the Warren Commission report could have prevailed easily over Mr. Jenner. He only wrote about half of it and didn't know anything at all about the evidence in the case. And Jerry Williams said last night, as he was recalling that moment, he said Jenner was shaking, Jenner was lacerated and destroyed, and then at about 11 o'clock at night, they had received, in Chicago, they had a computer on to find out how many calls had come in. 15,000 telephone calls. 15,000 telephone calls had come in, and so they agreed to keep the microphone open. CBS rearranged the schedule. We were going to be there all night long, Jerry Williams and Jenner and me, answering phone calls. And Jenner said, I understand that I have to catch a plane to Los Angeles, and I have to leave right now. And so he left before the program was over. And, of course, the first thing we did during the commercial break was to call the airlines and to discover that there were no planes going to Los Angeles. Okay. That was one effort then. And then Jenner said he would never again debate with any of us. And so far as I know, he's kept his commitment. And there was another lawyer for the commission named Joseph Ball. He was in Los Angeles, at Beverly Hills. He was going to debate me at the Beverly Hills High School. And we agreed, and the place was mobbed, about 2,000 or 3,000 people. And here was a lawyer for the commission who had who played a key role in developing the material around what took place in Dealey Plaza. He was a crucial person. And just before the debate began, he said, this is the way it's going to have to go. This is the only way I'll agree. I speak first. He speaks first. 45 minutes. Followed by another lawyer associated with him who would then speak for half an hour. And then Al Weirin of the American Civil Liberties Union, who supported their position, was then going to speak for 15 minutes. Then I had 20 minutes to speak, and the rest of the evening they would question me, but I couldn't question them. So how do you feel about that? And I said, great, let's go out and do it. And that's what we did. And they then said that they would never debate again with any of the critics of the Warren Court. And then the last one that I recall was Louis Nizer, right. And Louis Nizer was going to do a television debate in New York City on Metro Media. And he said his terms were that before we did any questioning of each other, he was going to speak for 45 minutes. I said, okay, fine. And that's what he did. And then he said he would never debate anyone again on the Warren Report, and he never did. So that area failed, because there is no defense for the Warren Commission report. And although they tried that with some of, I guess, the best they had to offer, they never made out a very good case, because there is no case that can be made out. And so that was the end, basically, of that stage of direct confrontation with the critics. And then I think they have moved into the last stage, although there you will probably still use portions of all of the other areas. But I think domestic intelligence has moved into the final stage. And that is a serious effort to discredit us, to make it appear that we are kooks, to make it appear that we are quarreling with each other. How can the American public know what really happened that day if people who've worked on the subject for 10 years or 11 years can't even agree about what the facts are? Talk to the reporters, you'll hear that. That's what they're saying. They're attacking each other and disagreeing on essential questions. How can anyone know? Let's just forget it. It's a hopeless situation. Number one. Number two, so much speculation and so many theories which have no basis in fact that they must be kooks. I heard it even last night on the Jerry Williams show. And I know Jerry Williams. I mean, I knew him when he believed the Warren Report in Boston and Chicago. And I know he doesn't believe it anymore, and he says it on the air. He now says it. He's changed dramatically on that question. And he is, in fact, one of the strongest allies that those who do not believe the critics of the report have in the media. Yet he, too, is talking about the kooks and the people making statements which I can't follow, and I've been following for 10 years. I don't know what they're talking about, etc. Now, and there's a major reporter here who said if he writes about this, he'd have to write about this conference in a humorous fashion. And I told that to Flo, and Flo said, look, they take football games seriously. Why can't they take this conference seriously? And it's true. It's true. But the fact is that we have to, I think, develop a strategy, a political strategy, which deals with what domestic intelligence is trying to do to those of us, all of us, who are seriously concerned about seeing this matter high on the political agenda until there are answers. Now, I believe, as I said last evening, I believe very strongly that we are at a different period now regarding the assassination of John Kennedy than we ever were before. 10 years ago, we knew the Warren Report was a lie, and that was removed as an obstacle. And there's still more proof. Every once in a while, when you meet a reporter, they say, what's the new evidence in the case? Have you uncovered any new evidence? What's wrong with the old evidence? I mean, it all happened back there, November 22nd, 1963. All the evidence is 11 years old. It's true sometimes we discover more information now to let us know something about what happened then that we didn't know before. But the old evidence is sufficient. All you got to do is look at the Zapruder film one time. You can't believe the report. Or read any of the serious critiques which have been done of the Commission, where the Commission's own evidence has been used to confront the Commission's own conclusions, and you know you can't believe that. We've known that for a decade. But what has changed now is not that it is clear that we can prove that the Warren Report is a lie. We could have done that 10 years ago. And to the satisfaction in 1966, according to the Gallup poll, of 78% of the American people. We were able to do that then. What's changed between 66 then and 1975? What has changed, I think, is a political climate in which it is now possible to even convince members of Congress and members of the Senate, if they want to get reelected, that they'd better show some concern for what we may be able to place on the political agenda in the days ahead. I think that's what's changed. I think, therefore, we have to develop a political tactic designed to meet that end. We can talk, we're going to have a panel tonight about who done it, I think it's called. And a few of us are going to be on that, discussing that. I don't know what anybody else is going to say, but I don't know who did it. I don't know who killed John Kennedy. And I don't think really there are very many people at this conference, except maybe those sent here to listen by the Central Intelligence Agency or the FBI, who really know the answer, and they're not going to be on the panel tonight. But I know that we can find out who did it, and we can find out how deeply the origin of the murder of John Kennedy relates back to domestic intelligence. We can find that out, but not by ourselves asking questions solely, but by seeing to it that the apparatus of government, which is there to serve us, begins to do that. By seeing to it that the people who have subpoena power, power to utilize contempt against those who won't answer questions, and perjury indictments against those who lie, utilize those powers. And I believe that if we can turn this from something from what it has been all these years, people with generally with a really healthy curiosity about what happened, into something which is a much higher stage, people with a committed political perspective and understanding, to insist upon utilizing the apparatus of government, then I think we can get the answer to that question, to all the questions, or many of the questions. I mean, we know 1,000, and we have a role to play, all of us. Those of us who have some particular information, who've done some work, and that goes for an awful lot of people who are here, dozens of people who are here, we can prepare the questions that Frank Church and counsel of his committee will ask, and prepare the list of witnesses who are to be subpoenaed. And I believe that they will do that. I know we can make them do it. I believe that some of them are now inclined to do it. Same thing is true for Don Edwards' committee. Same thing is true for the CIA Select Committee, which will be chosen in the House of Representatives. We have a role to play. We can be a liaison between the people in this country who want the facts and the committee that may lend itself to be a tool for the people of this country. That means, I think, tomorrow we have our plenary session where we're going to discuss what we should be doing. That means, I think, giving a lot of thought between now and tomorrow, and moving from the insatiable curiosity about every detail regarding the death of President Kennedy and the other assassinations into developing a political movement in this country where we'll get those answers for the first time. Understanding that a convoy moves at the speed of the slowest ship. And understanding that if someone is absolutely convinced that he or she knows who did it, but the rest of us aren't so sure, and that we have doubts, that you move at the speed of those who have the most doubts. And that we put together a comprehensive series of questions which we want submitted. We put together a petition which should be brought to every college campus in this country as starters, that we end up by presenting to Frank Church and Don Edwards and whoever chairs that CIA Select Committee in the House, millions of signatures on petitions and letters and resolutions by organizations all around this country, that we don't allow anybody to run for any high office without demonstrations until he answers the question about what he's done, what he's going to do, no matter who that candidate is, on this vital question. Because what does the election mean? What does it mean if we work for 6 months or a year to elect a man or a woman because we believe that that candidate, if elected, will change our lives so we can control our own destinies, and then they blow his head off in Dallas and lie about it? What does all that mean? And that's what we have to say to every candidate for public office. We want to know what happened then, because that's the only assurance we have that it may not happen again. And we can do that, I think, if between now and tomorrow we give serious consideration to how it is we can put together a viable political organization to meet the challenges that are imposed upon us not just by the assassination, by the cover-up, but by the massive and clever and intricate domestic intelligence operation designed against all of us, and some of us specifically, but all of us in general, that has thus far kept us from reaching that high political perspective and action which can result in the answers. And I think it would be good if we gave a lot of thought to that, and tomorrow we got up with ideas and we left here tomorrow. If we leave here tomorrow with a committed program, because looking at the Zapruder film and seeing his head blown off time after time is not the answer. That just tells us how horrible is the beast that runs this country. But that's not enough. Now we have to understand that we can remove that beast and begin to control our own lives. That's something we have to do between today and the time we leave tomorrow. Thank you.
You've been listening to a panel on domestic intelligence recorded at the Assassination Information Bureau conference held January